She held my hand too long before she ever touched the ring. I felt something crack open inside my chest. 6 months later. Everything I loved was on fire. My mother said choose the family or choose her. I chose the woman with soot on her knuckles. But someone wanted us destroyed before we said, I do. This is the story of the ring that almost ended me. My name is Danny Whitfield. 29 years old. Raised in a small town outside Charlotte, North Carolina, where love was supposed to look one particular way. I never imagined a jewelry forge in Asheville would crack open everything I thought I knew about myself, my family, and what I was allowed to want. I broke my engagement to Caleb 3 weeks before the wedding, and my mother still hadn't forgiven me for it. The only thing I kept from that life was my grandmother's ring, an antique band too small for my knuckle now. A friend recommended a jeweler in West Asheville who forged everything by hand, in a converted garage behind an old brick building. The sign above the door read Ember and Vine, painted in gold letters that had started to peel at the edges. Inside smelled like scorched metal and beeswax, and a woman in a leather apron looked up from her workbench without smiling. Her name was Wren Callahan, and she had soot smudged along her jaw and calluses roughened across both palms. I explained what I needed, and she held out her hand for the ring without saying a single word yet. She turned it over twice, studying the engraving inside the band like it was a language she already understood. This is old, she said finally. Older than you probably think it is. Her voice was low, unhurried, certain. Then she reached for my hand instead of the ring, turning it gently to check where the resize needed to happen. She held my fingers a beat longer than the job required, and I felt heat climb up the back of my neck. Sorry, she said. Not sounding sorry at all. I just wanted to see how it used to fit you. I told her it never really fit me, that I'd only started wearing it after my grandmother passed 2 years ago. Wren nodded slowly, set the ring down gently, and said she'd need a week to get the sizing exactly right. I left without her name, only to realize on the drive home that I'd already memorized the shape of her hands. I texted Priya a blurry photo of the shop sign, joking that I'd found the strangest excuse to skip errands all week. That night I couldn't stop thinking about the calm in Wren's voice, so different from the chaos I'd left behind with Caleb. I returned a week later under the excuse of picking up the ring, though I'd already found 3 other errands to justify the drive. Wren was waiting at the counter, and this time she smiled first. A small crooked thing that undid something tight in my chest. She slid the ring across the counter, resized perfectly, and asked if I wanted to see the rest of her workshop. I said yes before I'd finished thinking about it, and she led me past curtains of hanging tools into the back room. Molten metal glowed orange in a small furnace, and she explained the process with a patience that felt like a gift. I asked how long she'd been forging jewelry, and she said her grandfather taught her before he passed when she was 19. We talked for 2 hours about nothing important, and I forgot entirely that I had somewhere else to be that evening. When I finally left, she asked if I wanted to come back and watch her cast a custom piece the following week. I told myself I was only interested in the craft, though I texted my best friend Priya the second I got home. Priya read my message twice and asked, bluntly, whether I realized I sounded like someone with a crush developing. I laughed it off. But that night I lay awake replaying the exact moment Wren's hand had lingered on mine. I visited Ember and Vine 3 more times that month, always with some new excuse about jewelry care or cleaning solutions. Wren never called me out on the excuses, but her smile grew a little wider each time the bell above the door rang. One afternoon she taught me to hold a hammer properly, standing close behind me to correct the angle of my wrist. Her breath was warm near my ear, and I forgot the instructions entirely, focused only on the space between our bodies. You're not really here for the ring anymore, are you? She said quietly. Not as an accusation but as an invitation. I admitted it, my voice shakier than I intended, and she set down the hammer and simply looked at me. I don't usually do this, she said, but I'd like to take you to dinner, if that's something you'd want. I said yes so fast that she laughed, the sound warm and surprised. like she hadn't expected me to be certain. Our first date was at a small diner 2 blocks from her studio, both of us still smelling faintly of metal and smoke. She told me about growing up in rural Tennessee, about leaving home at 18 because her family couldn't accept who she was. I told her about Caleb, about the wedding I called off, about the confusion I'd never let myself examine too closely. "Have you ever been with a woman before?" she asked gently. And I admitted I hadn't. Not once. Not really. "No pressure," she said. "I just want you to know yourself before you know me. If that makes any sense." That honesty terrified me and steadied me at the same time, like she'd handed me permission I didn't know I needed. We started seeing each other twice a week, then 3 times, until the Forge became the place I felt most like myself. She showed me an old ring in her private collection, one she said her grandfather made for a customer decades earlier. The engraving inside matched my grandmother's ring almost exactly, a small detail neither of us commented on at the time. I didn't think much of it then, distracted instead by the way she wrapped an arm around my waist while explaining. Our first kiss happened by accident, foreheads bumping while we laughed over a ruined piece of silver on her workbench. Neither of us pulled away, and the kiss that followed was slow, careful, like she was asking a question with her mouth. I kissed her back with a certainty that surprised me, something clicking into place that Caleb had never once touched. Walking home that night, I finally let myself say the word aloud, quietly, testing how it felt on my tongue. Gay. Called Priya, crying. Not from sadness but from the strange relief of finally understanding a shape I'd always avoided naming. Priya didn't seem surprised at all, admitting she'd suspected for years but never wanted to push me before I was ready. Ren and I fell into an easy rhythm. Dinners after closing, long drives with the windows down, quiet mornings at her apartment. She never rushed me, letting me set the pace even when I could tell she wanted to say more than she did. One night she told me she loved me, plainly, without ceremony, while we sat on her tailgate watching the sun go down. I said it back without hesitation, surprising myself with how easily the words arrived once I finally let them. For the first time in years, I felt entirely unafraid of who I was becoming, entirely unafraid of wanting someone this much. I hadn't told my parents yet, and the longer I waited, the heavier that silence sat in my chest. Ren never pushed me to come out before I was ready, though I could see the worry behind her patient eyes. I started imagining a future I'd never let myself picture before, one with her hands in mine at a kitchen table. Then my mother called, asking why I kept canceling Sunday dinner, and I knew the silence couldn't hold much longer. I told her I was seeing someone, and she asked, with careful hope, whether Caleb had finally come back around. She started leaving small sketches of jewelry designs on receipts, silly little doodles that somehow always made me smile for hours. I learned she preferred quiet mornings, strong coffee, and old vinyl records playing low while she worked at her bench. We took a weekend trip to the coast, and I watched her collect sea glass with the same focus she gave her craft. For the first time in my life, a relationship felt like expansion instead of shrinking myself to fit someone else's expectations. I began writing in a journal again, filling pages with the strange, steady joy of finally being known completely. I told my mother the truth, that I was seeing a woman named Ren, and the line went silent for a long moment. "This isn't who you are," she finally said, her voice tight. "You were engaged to a man 8 months ago." I tried to explain that I'd never truly known myself before now, but she interrupted, asking me not to say it again. My father got on the phone next, quieter than my mother but somehow colder, asking if this was some kind of phase. He said the family had a reputation in our town, and he wasn't sure he could explain this to our church community. I hung up shaking, and Ren found me on her porch steps an hour later. Having driven over the moment I texted her, she held me without saying anything useful, just present, just solid, letting me cry until I had nothing left to give. The following Sunday, my mother didn't call, And the Sunday after that. And the silence became its own kind of answer. Priya was the only family-adjacent person who showed up, bringing takeout and sitting with me through the worst of the quiet. At work, a coworker mentioned seeing me at Ember and Vine with that jeweler, and I realized our town had already started talking. I told Ren about the rumors, expecting her to be upset, but she only sighed like she'd heard this story before. Small towns love a story, she said. I left mine because of exactly this kind of talk about who I loved. She told me more about her own family then. How her mother had stopped speaking to her the day she came out at 20. Her father had passed 2 years later, and she never got the chance to make things right before he was gone. I understood. Finally. Why she moved so carefully with me. Why she never pushed harder than I could handle. One evening, Caleb showed up at the forge unannounced, asking Ren directly whether she knew she'd ruined his engagement. Ren's face changed instantly, recognition flickering across it, and she asked him quietly how he even knew where to find her. It turned out Caleb and Ren had crossed paths years earlier, when he tried to buy a custom ring and never paid the balance owed. Ren had reported the unpaid debt publicly online, and Caleb had never forgiven the damage it caused to his reputation. Now he stood in her shop, furious, threatening to tell everyone in town that she'd stolen his fiancée out of spite. I stepped between them, telling Caleb this had nothing to do with revenge, that I simply loved someone he never could accept. He left angry, slamming the door hard enough to rattle the glass, promising this wasn't over between the three of us. That night, Ren admitted she was scared. Not of Caleb exactly, but of losing another relationship to someone else's shame. I promised her I wasn't going anywhere, though a small, honest part of me wondered if I could survive losing my family too. 2 weeks later, my mother finally called again, asking to meet, but only if I came alone. Without that woman, I agreed, hoping for reconciliation. But the dinner turned into an ambush with my father, and even Caleb's mother present. They spent an hour trying to convince me this was confusion, grief, a phase brought on by a broken engagement. I left the table shaking, furious, realizing they didn't want a conversation. They wanted a surrender I wasn't willing to give. I drove straight to the forge, and Ren opened the door before I even knocked, like she'd been waiting all evening. I broke down completely, admitting how exhausted I was carrying 2 versions of myself, one for them and one for her. You don't have to carry both, she said. Not for people who won't even try to carry any of it with you. Her words steadied me, but I could feel doubt creeping in anyway, quiet and persistent, whispering that I was destroying my family. Business at Ember and Vine slowed that month too. A few loyal customers quietly disappearing after word of the scandal spread. Ren never blamed me for it, but I saw the worry in the way she recalculated the shop's numbers late at night. I offered to help however I could, but she waved me off, insisting this wasn't my burden to carry alongside everything else. I started to wonder if loving me was costing her more than she'd ever admit, more than I was willing to see. One night, exhausted and raw, we argued for the first time, both of us saying things neither of us fully meant. I accused her of pulling away. She accused me of still hoping my parents would eventually make this easier than it was. She wasn't wrong. And hearing it out loud cracked something open I'd been avoiding since the day I came out. I left her apartment that night, needing space, needing to sit alone with the mess I hadn't let myself feel yet. For 3 days we didn't speak, and I questioned everything, wondering if I'd traded one kind of loneliness for another. Priya reminded me, gently, that growth was supposed to feel exactly this uncomfortable, that easy paths rarely led anywhere true. I finally texted Ren, asking if we could talk, and she replied within a minute, agreeing to meet at the forge. We sat on the same tailgate where she'd first told me she loved me, both of us quieter, both of us more honest. I'm not scared of loving you, she said. I'm scared of watching you lose everything and blaming me for it later. My younger brother, Tyler, texted privately to say he didn't care who I loved, though he asked me not to tell our parents yet. I clung to that small kindness for weeks, rationing it like the only proof my family hadn't entirely turned against me. A woman from my mother's church stopped me in the grocery store, offering unsolicited prayers for my confusion, in a syrupy voice. I stood frozen in the cereal aisle, humiliated, until a stranger nearby simply told the woman to mind her own business. That small act of defense from someone I'd never met stayed with me longer than any cruelty from people who claimed to love me. I told her the blame was never hers, that the fear belonged to me and I needed to finally own it myself. We agreed to stop hiding pieces of ourselves from each other, promising honesty even when honesty was harder than silence. Slowly, things steadied, the shop's regulars trickling back once the initial gossip lost its momentum around town. Then, on a Tuesday night, I woke to Ren's frantic phone call. The forge was on fire, and she needed me now. I arrived to find flames climbing the back wall, smoke pouring from the workshop where her grandfather's tools were kept. Firefighters got it under control before the whole building burned, but the back room, her private collection, was destroyed completely. Investigators later confirmed the fire started near an unlocked side door, evidence pointing toward deliberate ignition rather than accident. Ren stood in the wreckage the next morning, ash coating her boots, staring at the melted remains of her grandfather's forge. I held her while she cried for the first time since I'd known her, grief finally breaking through her steady calm. Police questioned several people, including Caleb, who denied everything but couldn't account for his whereabouts that particular night. No charges were filed without stronger evidence, but I knew, and Ren knew, exactly who wanted this business gone. Insurance covered some of the damage, but the emotional cost felt heavier than anything a check could ever repair. In the wreckage, I found the old ring, the one matching my grandmother's, warped but somehow not entirely destroyed by the flames. Ren held it carefully, explaining finally that her grandfather had made two identical rings decades ago for a set of sisters. One sister was my grandmother, she said. The other had been Ren's own great-aunt, a secret neither family ever spoke about. It turned out our grandmothers had once been close, inseparable even, before something quiet and unspoken tore their friendship apart. Ren's late grandfather had kept letters explaining it, letters we found boxed beneath the workbench that miraculously survived the fire. The letters revealed my grandmother had loved Ren's great-aunt once, decades before either of them married men out of obligation. I sat on the scorched floor reading faded handwriting, realizing the same fear that shaped my life had shaped my grandmother's too. It explained why she'd left me that ring specifically, a quiet message passed down through generations she never got to say aloud. I brought the letters to my mother, hoping this history might soften something in her, might explain what I was living now. My mother read them silently, her hands trembling, before admitting she'd found similar letters years ago and hidden them away. She confessed she'd always suspected the truth about her own mother, and had spent years afraid of what it meant for me. I didn't want you to inherit her pain, my mother said quietly, so I tried to steer you somewhere safer instead. It wasn't forgiveness yet, but it was the first real conversation we'd had since I came out, and it cracked something open. Meanwhile, Ren decided to rebuild the forge, refusing to let one act of cruelty erase decades of her grandfather's legacy. I helped however she'd let me, sanding, painting, sorting salvageable tools, determined to give her business a fighting chance again. Caleb, humiliated by rumors that he was involved, left town abruptly, taking a job 2 states away without any real explanation. His departure felt like an unspoken confession, though we never got the confirmation we both quietly wanted. With the immediate threat gone, Ren and I grew closer than ever, rebuilding something sturdier out of what almost broke us. One evening she asked me to move in with her, admitting she couldn't imagine building this new chapter without me beside her. I said yes without hesitation, packing my apartment within 2 weeks, ready to plant roots in a life I finally chose myself. My father, hearing the news secondhand, called to say he wasn't ready to accept any of this, and might never be. It hurt. But for the first time it didn't shatter me, because I had somewhere solid enough to stand while it hurt. My mother, quietly, started texting again. Small things at first. Recipes and weather updates. Testing whether the door could reopen. I invited her to visit the rebuilt forge. And to my surprise, she actually came. Standing awkwardly near the doorway, she watched Ren work for nearly an hour, silent, before finally saying the craftsmanship reminded her of her own mother's old ring. It was the closest thing to acceptance she'd offered yet, and I let myself hold on to it without demanding more. Ren and I began talking seriously about the future, about what commitment might look like for two women building a life together. She started sketching ring designs late at night, hiding the sketchbook whenever I walked into the room unannounced. I pretended not to notice, though my heart raced every time I caught a glimpse of gold bands on her table. The community around Ember and Vine slowly shifted too, some longtime customers returning with quiet apologies for their earlier silence. A local newspaper even ran a feature on the rebuilt shop, calling it a story of resilience, without ever naming what almost destroyed it. It felt, for the first time since coming out, that my two worlds might eventually learn to exist in the same room. Rebuilding the forge took months, and every scorched beam we replaced felt like proof we were choosing each other on purpose. Ren's old apprentice returned to help, bringing 2 other craftspeople from Asheville's tight artisan community to speed the reconstruction along. I learned to weld small pieces myself that summer, clumsy at first, though Ren said my hands were steadier than I gave them credit for. We hung the surviving letters from our grandmothers on the new workshop wall, framed carefully behind glass near the front counter. Customers who saw them often asked about the story, and slowly, telling it stopped feeling like exposure and started feeling like pride. But just as things steadied, an anonymous letter arrived at my parents' house, threatening to expose family secrets if I didn't leave town. My mother called immediately, terrified, reading the letter aloud in a shaking voice I'd never heard from her before. The letter referenced my grandmother's old relationship, threatening to spread the story through our tight-knit, gossip-hungry church community. I suspected Caleb immediately, though he was supposedly states away, and I wondered if he still had someone local doing his work. Ren and I drove straight to my parents' house, arriving to find my father pacing the living room, furious and frightened at once. For the first time, my father didn't direct his anger at me, but at whoever was threatening to hurt our family this way. "Nobody threatens my daughter," he said, voice breaking. And I realized this was the closest thing to protection he'd offered me in months. We reported the letter to the police, who traced it back to a disgruntled former customer of Ren's, not Caleb after all. The man had lost a deposit dispute months earlier and, learning of our relationship through town gossip, decided to weaponize it out of spite. He was charged with harassment, and the case quietly resolved itself. But the fear it stirred lingered in our house for weeks. Strangely, the threat did what months of conversation couldn't. It pulled my parents and me back into the same room, allied for once. My father sat with me on the porch afterward, admitting quietly that watching someone threaten me had terrified him more than my being gay ever did. "I don't understand all of it," he said, "but I understand wanting to protect you. And that has to be enough for now." It wasn't a full acceptance, but it was an opening. A door left slightly ajar instead of locked entirely shut. My mother started attending a small support group for parents of LGBTQ children, something she never told me about until months later. Slowly, dinners resumed, awkward but real, with Ren eventually invited to sit at the same table where I'd once feared exposure. The first time she came, my father barely spoke, but he passed her the mashed potatoes without being asked, and I nearly cried. Ember and Vine hosted a community reopening event that spring, and Ren asked me to stand beside her at the front door. Neighbors who'd once whispered showed up with flowers and casseroles, the kind of quiet apology small towns offer instead of words. Before the reopening event, Ren confessed she'd asked my father privately for his blessing, terrified but determined to do it properly. He hadn't said yes outright, she admitted. But he also hadn't said no, which felt like enough to move forward with hope. I found out later he'd spent that whole week practicing what to say, rehearsing kindness like a language he was only just learning. Near the end of the event, Ren asked everyone for a moment of attention, and my stomach dropped. Sensing something significant coming, she pulled out a small velvet box, explaining she'd forged the ring herself from the melted remains of her grandfather's original piece. It was fused, she said, with metal from my grandmother's ring, joining both women's unfinished stories into something whole at last. She got down on one knee in front of the entire shop, asking if I would marry her. Right there. Publicly. Unafraid. I said yes before she finished the sentence, tears blurring the room, the crowd erupting into applause around us. I looked up and saw my mother crying too. Not from grief this time, but from something closer to pride. My father stood beside her, arms crossed, jaw tight, but he was still standing there, still present, still choosing to stay. Later that night, Ren admitted she'd almost lost her nerve, worried I might say no in front of everyone we knew. I told her nothing could have stopped my answer. Not fear, not family, not the version of myself I used to be. We spent weeks afterward planning a small wedding, one that honored both our grandmothers without ever needing to explain the whole history. My mother offered to help with flowers, a gesture so ordinary and so enormous that I had to leave the room to cry. My father still struggled with the language of it all, but he asked, quietly, if he could walk me down the aisle. I said yes, understanding that healing rarely arrives all at once, that sometimes it comes wrapped in small, imperfect gestures instead. Caleb never resurfaced, and eventually I stopped waiting for an apology that was never going to reshape anything about my life. Priya stood as my maid of honor, reminding me the night before that she'd known this version of me long before I did. On the morning of the wedding, I wore my grandmother's original ring on my right hand, and Ren's new one on my left. Both metals caught the light the same way, as though decades apart, two women had finally found their way back to each other. We married in the garden behind Ember and Vine, surrounded by family who had finally learned how to stay instead of leave. I used to think love meant choosing between who I was and who I loved, until Ren taught me they were never separate at all. Then